Eli woke up before the sun did. That was not unusual for him. In the royal palace, servants were expected to be awake, dressed, and working before the first light touched the tall windows of the great hall. Eli had been doing this for 4 years. He knew every cold corridor, every creaking floorboard, every shadow in that massive building. He had learned them not because anyone taught him, but because he had spent so much time alone in them. He was 26 years old. He was not a large man. His frame was lean, his hands were rough from years of scrubbing and carrying, and he walked with a slight limp, a permanent reminder of a fall he had taken as a young boy. His face was calm, almost too calm, some people said. They called it emptiness. They called it dullness. They did not understand that a person can be very still on the outside and very deep on the inside. Nobody in the palace knew where Eli had come from before he arrived at the gates 4 years ago, with a small cloth bag and a letter asking for honest work. The head steward had looked him up and down and assigned him to the lowest duties without a second thought. Eli had accepted this without complaint. He washed floors, carried firewood, cleaned fireplaces, and did whatever he was told. He was never late. He never argued. He never asked for more than he was given. And yet, somehow, his quietness made certain people very uncomfortable. Lord Cade was one of those people. Lord Cade was a wide, loud man with a heavy gold ring on every finger and a voice that seemed to bounce off every wall in whatever room he entered. He had inherited his title from his father, and his father before that, and he wore that inheritance like a shield, as if being born into a name was the same as earning respect. He had taken a particular dislike to Eli almost from the beginning. No one could explain exactly why. Perhaps it was because Eli never looked afraid when Cade walked past. Perhaps it was because Eli's silence felt, to a man like Cade, like a quiet form of disagreement. Whatever the reason, Cade made a habit of making Eli's days harder whenever he could. He would knock a tray from Eli's hands and then stare at him, daring him to react. He would speak loudly about the limping servant when Eli was within earshot, making other nobles laugh. He once had Eli scrub the same hallway floor 3 times in one morning, claiming each time that it was not clean enough, even though it was spotless. Eli scrubbed it 3 times without a word. Sera, the head maid, was no kinder. She was a sharp-faced woman who had worked in the palace for over 15 years and had built her position piece by piece through loyalty to whoever was in charge above her. She managed the servant staff with the precision of someone who believed order required fear. She had a ledger in which she recorded every small mistake any servant made, and she took particular pleasure in noting Eli's errors, whether they were real or not. "The broken one slowed the morning service again," she would write, even on days when Eli had been the first to arrive and the last to leave. She called him the broken one because of his limp. She said it as if a damaged leg meant a damaged spirit. She could not have been more wrong. Then there was Prince Rowan. The king's second son was 22 years old, and had been raised in a world where everything he wanted appeared before he finished asking for it. He was not a cruel person by nature, not the way Cade was, but he was careless. He had never been taught to look at the people who served him as real people. Servants, to Rowan, were part of the furniture. They existed in the background of his life, and when they stepped into the foreground, it irritated him. Eli had stepped into his foreground 3 times by accident, once by turning a corner too quickly, once by being in a doorway when Rowan expected it to be clear, and once simply by being visible when the prince was in a bad mood. Each time, Rowan had made a scene. Each time, Eli had bowed and stepped back. Each time, the watching nobles and servants had snickered or shaken their heads at poor, clumsy, broken Eli. None of them asked why Eli never fought back. They assumed it was because he had nothing to fight back with. They did not know about the small object Eli kept in the inner pocket of his jacket, pressed against his chest every single day. It was a royal seal, old, heavy, made of deep red wax over carved gold. His mother had placed it in his hand the night she died, when he was 19 years old, and sitting beside her bed in the small, cold house where they had lived for as long as he could remember. "Go to the palace," she had whispered. "Not to take anything, not to demand anything, just go and wait. Your father will know you when the time comes. Truth does not need to shout, it only needs to survive." She had told him, in those final hours, everything. about who she had once been, about the night she had to run, about the people who had forced her out and stolen her place, about the king who had been lied to and believed the lies because he had no reason not to, about the son, Eli himself, who had been reported dead so that the people around the throne could control what came next. Eli had listened to all of it with steady eyes. He had cried later, alone, after she was gone. Then he had picked up his bag, put the seal against his chest, and walked toward the palace. He had been waiting for 4 years now. He was still waiting. The day everything changed began like every other day. It was the anniversary of the kingdom's founding, a grand occasion that required the entire palace to prepare for a formal banquet. The great hall had to be decorated, the tables set with the finest dishes, the floors polished until they shone like still water. Every servant was given double the usual duties. Eli was assigned the heaviest tasks, as always. He carried crate after crate of supplies from the storage rooms to the kitchen, climbed ladders to hang long banners from the rafters, and spent an hour on his knees polishing the marble floor near the entrance. He was carrying a tray of silverware down the main corridor when Lord Cade appeared around the corner, with 2 of his companions, laughing loudly about something. Cade saw Eli and, without breaking stride, reached out and knocked the tray from his hands. The sound was enormous in the quiet corridor. Silverware scattered across the marble floor, spinning and clattering. Cade looked down at the mess, and then up at Eli with a wide smile. "Careful," he said. "Accidents like that reflect badly on you." His companions laughed. A guard standing nearby turned away. A kitchen girl passing at the far end of the corridor quickened her pace. Eli said nothing. He lowered himself to one knee and began picking up each piece of silverware, one by one, placing them carefully back on the tray. When he was done, he stood, adjusted his jacket, and continued down the corridor. He did not look back. It was late afternoon when Eli was crossing the outer courtyard with an empty bucket when he noticed the old man. He was sitting against the wall near the palace stables, his head resting on his chest, his breathing slow and uneven. He was dressed in traveling clothes, dusty, worn from a long road. The guards had walked past him at least twice without stopping. Eli set down his bucket and went to him. He crouched beside the man, put a hand on his shoulder, and spoke gently. The old man stirred. His eyes opened slowly, and for a long moment, he simply stared at Eli's face. Something moved behind his eyes. Recognition, or something very close to it. "Water," the man managed. Eli filled his cup from the bucket, held it steady while the man drank, and then sat beside him until his breathing settled. When the man's color improved, Eli helped him to his feet, draped the man's arm over his own shoulders, and carried him inside to a quiet room near the servants' quarters, where there was a proper bed and warmth. "You don't know who I am," the old man said, as Eli helped him lie down. "It doesn't matter," Eli said. "You needed help." The man looked at him again with that same sharp attention. Then he closed his eyes and slept. His name was Regent Aldrich. He was the king's oldest advisor and most trusted friend. He had been traveling for 3 weeks, pushing hard despite his age, because he had found something, documents, records, witness accounts, that had consumed the last 2 years of his life to gather. He had found the truth about what happened to the king's firstborn son, who had been reported dead 24 years ago. Aldrich had not told anyone his purpose. He had arrived at the palace quietly, intending to go directly to the king, but his body had given out before his mind did. When he woke 3 hours later, and a young guard named Mira brought him food, he asked her one question before he ate. "The servant who brought me in, what do you know about him?" Mira thought for a moment. "His name is Eli," she said carefully. "He has been here 4 years. He is the hardest worker in this palace, and the most mistreated." She paused. "I have always thought there was something different about him, something I could never quite name." Aldrich nodded slowly. "There is," he said. "Bring him to me after the banquet, and say nothing to anyone." The great hall that evening was extraordinary. Hundreds of candles burned in the tall iron chandeliers overhead. The long tables were covered in white cloth and set with gold-edged dishes. Nobles in their finest clothes filled the room with conversation and color. At the head of the table, raised slightly above the rest, sat King Darian. The king was a man who had been described over the course of his life in many ways: powerful, distant, just, cold, grieving. He was all of these things, depending on which day you caught him. He had ruled for 30 years with a firm hand and a sharp mind. He had won battles and survived attempts on his throne. But those who watched him closely, really closely, could see that there was a particular kind of sadness in him that had never left. It sat behind his eyes like a stone at the bottom of a river, always there, always heavy. He had lost his firstborn son 24 years ago, or so he had been told. He had never fully recovered from it. Servants moved along the edges of the great hall, silent and efficient. Eli was among them, carrying a large serving dish from one end of the table to the other. He kept his eyes on his work. He moved carefully. He was halfway down the table when Prince Rowan raised his voice. "You, the limping one." Rowan did not even look directly at Eli. He spoke to the table more than to the person. "Stop hovering near my chair. You make me lose my appetite." A few nobles nearby laughed softly. Lord Cade, seated 2 chairs down, grinned and added loudly, "Our standards really have dropped, haven't they? Letting someone like that serve at a royal banquet." Sera, standing near the wall with her ledger, nodded in agreement. Eli stopped. He stepped back. He did not look at Rowan or Cade. He held the serving dish steady in both hands and waited for the moment to pass, the way he always did. But this time, something was different. From the head of the table, King Darian had gone very still. He had been watching, not the food, not the decorations, not his son's performance. He had been watching Eli. He had been watching the way Eli moved, the way he held himself even while being spoken to like he was nothing, the line of his jaw, the shape of his hands. Something had been pulling at the king's attention since the moment Eli entered the room, and he had not been able to identify it until now. "Bring him to me," the king said. The hall went quiet. Eli walked the full length of the great hall alone. Every eye in the room followed him. Some people were confused. Some were amused. Lord Cade's smile began to fade as he realized the king's expression was not what he expected. Eli stopped before the king and bowed respectfully. King Darian stood. He came down from the raised platform. He walked toward Eli and stopped directly in front of him. He looked at his face in the candlelight, the same way Aldrich had looked at him in the courtyard, and the stone behind the king's eyes cracked. His hands, which had never shaken before any enemy, trembled slightly at his sides. The doors at the back of the great hall opened. Mira entered, walking beside Regent Aldrich, who leaned on a wooden cane but held his head high. In his other hand, he carried a sealed leather pouch. The room was absolutely silent now. Aldrich stopped a short distance away and spoke in a clear, steady voice. "Your Majesty, 24 years ago, your firstborn son was taken from you by people who told you he had died. He did not die. His mother ran with him to keep him safe. She passed away 6 years ago. But he has been here, in this palace, for 4 years. He stands before you now." No one in the great hall breathed. King Darian reached out slowly and opened Aldrich's pouch. Inside were documents, records of birth, sealed letters, witness statements. And one other thing, a royal seal, identical to the one the king wore around his own neck. He looked at Eli. "Do you have it?" the king asked quietly. Eli reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and drew out the old seal his mother had given him. He placed it in the king's open hand. The king held both seals side by side. They were the same, exactly the same. Carved from the same mold, sealed on the same night, meant for the same child. King Darian closed his fingers around both seals. Then, in front of every noble, every official, every servant, and every guard in that great hall, he lowered himself to one knee, before the young man who had been scrubbing his floors. "My son," he said, his voice barely held. "I am sorry it took so long." Eli looked at his father. For 4 years, he had held everything in. Every insult, every humiliation, every lonely morning, every moment of being invisible to the people around him. He had held all of it steady inside his chest, the way a man holds a lamp in the wind with both hands. One tear moved down his face. "Just one. I am here," Eli said. "That is enough." The king rose, and then he turned to the hall. The room was frozen. Lord Cade had stopped smiling entirely. Prince Rowan had gone pale. Sera had pressed herself against the far wall, her ledger held tightly in both hands, as if it could protect her. The king did not raise his voice. He did not need to. When a man of his authority speaks quietly in a full room, the silence he creates is louder than any shout. "You laughed at this man," he said. "You called him broken. You knocked things from his hands and spoke over him as though he had no ears to hear you. You did this in my house, at my table, to my blood." He let that sit. He said nothing. He did his work. He served every one of you with more dignity than most of you have shown in your entire lives. I want you to understand what that means. It does not mean he was weak. It means he was stronger than all of you put together. Lord Cade's title was removed by royal decree before the evening was over. His lands would be reviewed. His name would carry a mark that his own children would have to work hard to remove. He left the great hall without his ring and without a word. Prince Rowan was not stripped of his name. He was the king's son, and the king was still his father. But he was formally removed from all ceremonial duties and placed under Regent Aldrich's direct instruction. He would spend the next year learning, truly learning, what it meant to lead. Not from books, from people. Sera was dismissed from the palace that night. She did not look back as she left. Mira, the guard who had always watched and never forgotten, was given the position of head of the royal guard. She accepted it with a quiet nod. Eli did not sleep that night. He sat in the room where Aldrich had recovered, and the old man sat with him. They talked for hours about his mother, who she had been before everything fell apart, how she had carried herself, what she had believed in. Aldrich had known her. He had helped her leave. He had carried guilt about it for 2 decades, wondering if she was safe, wondering about the boy she had taken with her. She was extraordinary, Aldrich said. She never became bitter, even when she had every right to be. I know, Eli said. She taught me that bitterness is a cage. You build it yourself and then complain that you cannot move. Aldrich looked at him for a long moment. She would be very proud of you. Eli was quiet for a while. Then he said, I hope so. On the 4th morning, Eli walked into the throne room. The king was already there waiting. There was no ceremony arranged. Eli had asked for that. No music, no crowd, no formal announcement. Just the 2 of them, and a few witnesses. He stood beside his father. The king looked at him and said simply, What do you want to do? Eli thought for a moment. Then he said, I want to change things. For the people who carry the heavy things, the ones who are told they don't matter. Because I know what that feels like, and I know that is not true. The king nodded. Then we will change them together. The people in the palace who had mocked Eli spent the following weeks in a particular kind of silence. Not the comfortable silence of peace, but the tight, uncomfortable silence of people who are replaying their own behavior in their heads and not liking what they see. Because they had not just mocked a servant. They had mocked a prince of the kingdom, a man who had every reason to be angry and chose not to be, who had every opportunity to expose them and chose to wait, who had spent 4 years being treated like nothing and had never once let it make him into something small. That was the part that stayed with people long after the events of that night. Not the revelation, not the punishment, not even the king going down on one knee. It was the fact that Eli, when given all the power in the world, chose to use it gently. His mother had told him that real power whispers, that it waits, that it does not need to announce itself, because when it finally arrives, there is nothing left to argue about. She had been right. There is a kind of strength that only reveals itself over time, not in fights or arguments or clever words, but in years of quiet endurance, in small acts of dignity repeated day after day, in the decision to keep going when no one is watching, and no one is clapping, and the work is hard, and the world does not seem to care. Eli had that strength. He had carried it into the palace in a small cloth bag. He had carried it through every scrubbed floor and knocked over tray, and cold morning, and public humiliation. He had carried it all the way to the moment when the truth finally arrived to meet him, and when it did, he was ready. He had always been ready.